Sorry. Good afternoon, good evening as you want. My name is SWOBODA. I'm president of the IIP, the premises you are in here. Unfortunately, we have to close the windows because of the noise from the outside, and as we record the discussion, so please apologies for this inconvenience you will have. Fortunately, today is not the hottest day, so we will hopefully survive. Thank you very much for coming. It's extraordinary that we do an event in summertime, but as we can see, it is highly appreciated that we have two special guests who will be presented by Stephanie Fenkart, our director, who is moderating the discussion. Ukraine, of course, Ukraine has always been on our minds since many years, and the position of the Institute is very clear. There is no justification for the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And there is full legal and whatever justification for supporting Ukraine in defending itself and supporting by the European Union, NATO and others. Nevertheless, we always have been interested in looking for any small chance where we can not come to peace directly, but maybe have a possibility to stop the war and stop the cruel killings of people, destruction of a whole country. So again, just to make it clear what our position is, what the background of our institute is, it's a peace institute, but peace does not mean that you should not and must not defend yourself and help the others to defend themselves against any kind of outside aggression. It's also, of course, a legal question and a political question and a question of defense and security in Europe. And therefore, we're very happy to have two outspoken experts here on the panel. And with that already, I will hand over to Stephanie to moderate the discussion and present our guests. Yes. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Thank you very much to the two of you for joining today. I would also like to mention our cooperation partner, the Austrian Center for Peace, who has been supporting us in holding this event. Nobody's here to give us a short welcome speech, but I nevertheless wanted to mention it. The topic of today is war in Ukraine, law versus reality, and we have two very distinguished guests whom I'm going to introduce right now. It's Franz-Stefan Gady, welcome. You are policy advisor and analyst at the Institute for International Strategic Studies in London. And obviously also Ralf Janik, he's an international law expert from the Sigmund Freud Private University and also an advisory member of the International Institute for Peace. Without further ado, since it's very hot today, and I think the discussion should also be focused on also with so many people here, I would hand over already to you and ask you maybe first, since I heard that you just have been coming back from Ukraine. Hannes already mentioned about what is going on, and it's been a very, very volatile environment, especially these days. I mean, we heard about Orban's peace mission. He went to Zelensky, then he went to Putin, but also to Xi Jinping, and then meeting Trump. On the other hand, we obviously are expecting elections in the US, and we don't really know what is happening there. And all of these issues obviously will also inflict upon Ukraine and what is happening on the ground there. But maybe first you can just share your experience. What have you been witnessing? How is the atmosphere? Maybe on the front line as well, but maybe also a little bit broader within the Ukrainian community. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Indeed, I was in Ukraine just a little bit over 2 weeks ago, and I spent about 14 days in the country and visited various parts, including Kiev, and then a portion of the front line in the east, in the Donbas region, where some of the heaviest fighting is taking place at the moment in the areas of Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. But also, my team and I, we went to Kharkiv and parts of the Kharkiv front line. And my impression is that this month actually is quite a crucial month when it comes to the war in Ukraine, for the simple reason that there has been, for the better part of a year now, I would say, a massive manpower shortage within the Ukrainian armed forces. And that is only slowly getting addressed now. And the Ukrainians, as some of you who are following the war may have heard, have passed a new mobilization law. That is, they can recruit, mobilize additional reservists into the armed forces. And they had their first mobilization run in May, and were actually quite successful. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we were there, actually, just to figure out how successful are the Ukrainians with recruiting additional personnel, because during one of our previous trips there, we noticed that this was one of the most severe constraints, rather than ammunition and weapon systems and so forth. What we came away with is that new reinforcements are only going to likely arrive on the front line at the end of this month, next month. So the Russians are probably going to try to do everything to make additional gains on the front line now. And we can see that every day you check the front line, there are some incremental shifts. So I don't really think it's an accurate picture to say that the front line is not really moving. It is incrementally moving, and the Russians are making advances. Here or there, the Ukrainians are counterattacking, seizing territory, but it's an extremely tough fight. It's a very bloody fight. It's really what you call an attritional contest. That is, both sides are throwing enormous amount of manpower and material, ammunition, and so forth against one another, with the idea of really attriting the other side, the opposite force. So the front line is quite in a condition at the moment, but we're getting to a point where I think the worst case scenario, that is the collapse of the front line, is unlikely, and it's going to be much more unlikely once the first reinforcements arrive. Okay, so that's the one picture on the front line, just to summarize it. The larger picture, though, that I think is going to be much more important for the duration of this year and early into next year is what's going to happen to the Ukrainian air defenses. That is, the Ukrainians are short of air defense missile interceptors. They're short of air defense systems to not only protect their troops on the front line, but also their cities first and foremost. And we've been to Kharkiv, for example, and the situation there has improved, but if you're there, you certainly hear and experience it sometimes also the bombings, right, of Russian airplanes dropping their bombs next to the place where we were staying. About 300 meters away, there was an explosion. Bomb hit a building, killed around 3 people, wounded about half a dozen. And the reason for that was not because the Russians were really targeting the civilian institution. It was because the guidance kit of that particular missile dropped off after the Russian bomber, after it clicked off the Russian bomber, right? And it hit a civilian area. Having said that, the Russians are clearly pursuing a terror strategy also in their bombing campaign. And the issue is, once Ukraine runs out of interceptors, it's going to be quite a dangerous situation. Not so much just for the front line, but for the country overall, because the Russians can really bomb then at will and also move in some of their other aircraft and bomb or increase really the bomb load that they're dropping on Ukrainian cities. And I think this in the long run will gonna have an impact, particularly as we approach the winter and particularly as parts of the critical infrastructure, including the energy grid and so forth, are going to get affected, because in the winter it's extremely cold in Ukraine, as some of you will know, obviously, and you will only have a few hours of heat and electricity per day. And I do think it's really part of the Russian strategy to really trigger a new exodus in the winter months of Ukrainian refugees. And I think I can see clearly that that's the strategy maybe around Kharkiv and in other parts of the country. And I think this is something where we as Western partners need to do everything to help avoid that scenario, because I think this is going to be, in the long run, quite devastating for Ukraine. So these are sort of my two broader impressions.
Thank you so much. I think it's very important that you mention, because I often have the feeling we talk about the war against Ukraine in a kind of an abstract way already. And I think it's very important that you see that people are actually hit by targets. I mean, we all heard about the recent huge attack on Kiev, where also a children's hospital was hit, something which is really very tough for us to understand what was going on there. Ralph, you're an international law expert, and we know that it is an illegal war. It's a war of aggression. Ukraine did not provoke it. And nevertheless, we also know that there is something like international law. So, I mean, wars are horrible, obviously, but what does this mean? I mean, when the event is called law versus reality, how does international law, humanitarian law, actually play in reality? So what would be your take on this in the specific case of Russia's war of aggression now against Ukraine?
Yeah, just a few words on why this event came into existence. I invited Franz-Stefan to attend one of my lectures on the war, on the law of armed conflict, and we, due to obvious reasons, we couldn't make it, so we thought, okay, so let's do an additional event, and I'm happy to see some of my former students here as well. And the basic idea why I invited you was to say, okay, I'm teaching law as you can see it in the books. Like, these are the rules that should be, that shall be upheld, that shall be respected, but at the same time we hear about a bombing campaign that deliberately targets civilian objects, that targets civilians, and that is aimed at targeting civilian infrastructure. So this is not only a war that would be, ideally, if we can use such a word during an armed conflict, between two opposing armed forces, but this is a war that is using civilians as somewhat as the Achilles heel. So that's why I wanted to ask myself, like, okay, so what do? We have all these rules that you may not target civilians, that you obviously may not target hospitals unless they are being abused or instrumentalized for military purposes. And even then you would need a proportionality assessment. So I will try to avoid talking about other conflicts as well that are currently also going on in parallel, like Gaza. But coming back to Ukraine, my question would be myself, like, what do? We have, ever since Grotius, at the very least, ever since the 17th century, the basic idea that the question whether you may start a war, the jus ad bellum, which I'm going to teach in fall, is, however, and there's a reason why I teach two classes, is completely separate from the jus in bello, the rules that apply in an armed conflict, regardless of whether you are lawfully defending yourself or whether you're the obvious aggressor. And my fear is that once one party or both that disrespect the rules or even purposely, deliberately use the rules to their favor by saying, we're going to attack your Achilles heel, your hospitals, your civilian homes, whatever you could think of, that this leads to a downward spiral where no one respects the law. Because the opposing party would then say, if we keep fighting according to the rules, we will end up losing this war. And if this is a war where you fight for your survival, you can't respect the law, because respecting the law would mean that you are, as a state or as a nation, effectively going to evaporate, that you will cease to exist. So that would be also my question, not only my answer, my far too long answer to your excellent question, would be also one to Franz-Stefan. What do you do in such a situation when you fight for survival as a nation, and at the same time you know that the rules exist, and perhaps even your partners say, if you do not respect the rules, we will not send you weapons, for example, or we will no longer train your military officers. So how do you maintain at least some minimum standard of the rules of war in a situation where a country is fighting for its very own survival?
I give the question already to you, and maybe you can also follow up. I mean, you mentioned already, it was mentioned, it's also a war on infrastructure, but wars recently have been changing a lot. I mean, we have a lot more drone wars with artificial intelligence, different weapon systems. So maybe if you can reflect on both of these issues, like how these new, let's say, I don't know, ways of how you actually do the combating on the ground, like how does this reflect on international law? What does this mean on the ground? Do people actually care at all about international humanitarian law once you are in such a situation? And do you think that these recent, I would say, these drone wars, as we call it, did this change somehow the role of international humanitarian law and international law or rules during combat in general?
I mean, these are all great questions, and I wish I would have an intelligent answer, but I can try my best. First of all, in terms of respecting humanitarian law, the laws of war, and so forth, I think it's very clear that there are two sides in this conflict, one of which is really utterly disregarding international humanitarian law by targeting civilian infrastructure and also really committing war crimes essentially on its own soldiers. I mean, one thing that is very prevalent now and that has really increased also in scope based on our trips is that the Russians are absolutely ruthless in maintaining military discipline. They sort of have solved their morale issue, so to speak, by just really summarily executing anyone who refuses to advance. Every single non-commissioned officer, anyone with any command authority has the authority to execute anyone on the spot, on the front line, who they think is not really executing their orders. And this is something that has really dramatically increased, right? So how do you have a military that is so cruel to its own soldiers, its own enlisted personnel, respect international humanitarian law, the rules of law, the rules of common decency, right, as George Orwell probably would have called it, against an adversary? And the answer is they don't, right? And I think the difference is that on the Ukrainian side, of course, like with any war, and I think I have a very dim perspective. That's my third conflict where I was at least actively in the combat zone, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. I have a fairly dim perspective on really the possibility of maintaining humanitarian law at all times, particularly in combat situations, because a combat situation is it's very, very intense in a way that it's hard to imagine if you haven't experienced it. And sometimes I feel like the moral universe is upside down for a moment in combat situations. And for example, the moment where you do have a lot of executions of prisoners is usually right after the cessation of firing, right? Just because your adrenaline is still up, you feel like you're threatened everywhere, and your natural instinct, I think, as a soldier, is I just want to eliminate all the threats or everyone who just has been shooting at me. And it's really pure self-preservation that you're like, okay, instead of taking the gun and taking this guy back, I don't know, maybe he's going to jump me, maybe he's going to do something, I might as well shoot him. And that's where very often a lot of these war crimes, unfortunately, happen right after the cessation of combat activities, from my own observation at least. And this is obviously something that should in no way be condoned. And I think my answer, how do you respect that? Through really iron discipline and really training your troops and particularly your officers. It's really the officer in charge. It's usually a very young platoon leader, 22, 24 years old, or a company commander who can make the difference when it comes to any of this, right? It's really the officer's job. And it's really the job also that he keeps his NCOs, his non-commissioned officers, in check. Now, the problem is in the Russian armed forces, you have the opposite problem, right? These people actually are actively encouraged to commit these sorts of atrocities on their own soldiers. So naturally, they will do so also with Ukrainian POWs. So in any case, I think you clearly have a case of systematic abuse and breaking of the humanitarian law. And then on the Ukrainian case, you'd obviously have people who are trying to do the good thing, try to respect it. Sometimes it gets broken, we need to be honest about that, but it's in nowhere comparable to what the Russians are doing. I do think it's possible to win a war also abiding by international humanitarian law. It has happened before, obviously, in many instances. Just think of, by and large, frankly, for the most part, the intervention in Afghanistan, and also the Falkland Wars by the British in the 1980s and 1982, by and large. But of course, war crimes are prevalent and they're everywhere. And it's very hard to stop them completely. I think the larger question is, can they systematically be stopped? And this is something that's obviously difficult in a war like in Ukraine. The other point that I want to make, because you mentioned drones, to me, this entire debate about, because I think that's what you were referring to, I assume autonomous killing, drone warfare and so forth, and the impact, and the debate around killer robots and so forth. Autonomy, to me, describes a relationship, right, between two entities. It doesn't really say anything about the capability of a particular weapon system. And never quite understood what the difference is at the end of the day, because you also can have a very jittery soldier pressing the wrong button at the wrong time, and still the impact is going to be this. Similarly, then you have somebody with a false, a drone with a false algorithm hitting the wrong target, right? Because the impact ultimately is what matters. It's discrimination and proportionality in that instance, and I think that's independent of autonomy. At least that's my understanding of the situation. How I would see it on the battlefield. You're right. We have moved more to an area in this war where unmanned vehicles mostly, whether it's in the air or on the ground, can be observed on the battlefield. And there are certain parts of the front line, frankly, and that's very interesting, at least for a military analyst like I am, where the most forward line of defense is under such heavy fire by the Russians, for example, or the Russians advanced on the left flank and the right flank, and there's like this little bulge in the front line that the Russians can cover perfectly with fire, and you have this pocket of Ukrainian soldiers on the forward defense, and they can't really retreat, they can't really evacuate their wounded, and they can't really receive new ammunition and new supplies. So you do a lot of that with drones these days. So a lot of the frontline troops actually now are being supplied by drones, which could not have happened about a year ago. So this really says a lot about the ability to technological adapt also in warfare. So a lot of resupply missions now currently on the front lines in Ukraine are flown by drones. At the same time, we've seen a move away, and this is, I think, often not so well understood on social media, away from these smaller drones, FPV drones, as they're called, first-person view drones, kamikaze drones, that are really improvised commercial drones turned kamikaze drones, away from these short drones that you see probably in social media and Telegram quite a bit if you follow the war, to so-called bomber drones, right? Larger bomber drones that are really hovering over the battlefield and are dropping increasingly heavier payloads on the opposing side. So there is this element of more remote warfare. Autonomous weapon systems, frankly, personally, I have not experienced that. I have not seen it yet. Of course, the question is, what really do we really mean by autonomy? I do think we'll get there eventually, and I think what's often very confused when we talk from a military technical perspective when we talk about autonomy and autonomous drones, it's essentially the same thing that you would see on any cruise missile or any ballistic missile technology that has been around for about 40 years, and that's called terminal guidance systems. Because the reasons why you have a lot of autonomy on the battlefield is because of electronic interference, right? Because you have GLONASS and GPS and all these other satellite navigation systems that get jammed essentially by electronic warfare systems, jammers on both sides, right? And in order not to lose the target very often, these sorts of cruise missiles and other missiles, ballistics missiles, have inertial navigation systems, essentially, that can switch to what's called terminal guidance. That is, they can really fly essentially into a box, blind, essentially, that they have pre-selected. And when you talk about artificial intelligence and autonomy, that's what you most often talk about now these days in Ukraine, right? So it's technology that has not really made the jump to the next level. It's there, but right now we are really talking about capabilities, and that's always the most important thing, because ultimately it's about what this weapon system can really do, not how it does it. We are really at a place where we have been probably a couple of decades ago already. So a word of caution here, just from a military technological perspective.
Maybe a follow-up question, because you mentioned also in the beginning the problems Ukraine is having when it comes to personnel, obviously mobilization, and Russians are slowly, at least at the time being, this is what I hear from military analysts, they are advancing slowly, but nevertheless they are. So considering that it is also the West supporting Ukraine with weapons, with everything, but we also know that they have some restraints. We remember the discussion when it was like, okay, Ukraine, you can use the weapons we are delivering there and there, but please not into mainland Russia or just to specific areas in mainland Russia. So we do know that there are other actors involved who also play out somehow in the battlefield. So what does this mean for Ukraine? I mean, what can actually be the goal of Ukraine right now, or let's say in the month to come before the winter is actually coming, from a military point of view as well, in this super difficult situation?
Yes, I mean, the larger question is, and that really only the Ukrainian political leadership and military leadership can answer, right? What's really the theory of success of Ukraine, right? What is the theory of success? Is the theory of victory in this regard? And I think that's a valid question to ask. When it comes to, and now I think I know what you were talking about with sort of following international humanitarian law, the strikes into Russia and all the limitations sort of imposed on Ukrainian weapon systems delivered by Western partners. Of course, it's an easy target, essentially, for us in the West, because for us in the West, it's mostly a discussion about what can we deliver, at least for those who really want to see, and I hope everyone wants to, see Ukraine win, prevail against this blatant war of aggression by Russia, that the focus usually is about ammunition and weapon systems, right? And that's a good discussion to have, and I think that's something also that obviously needs to happen. We need to continuously support Ukraine and so forth. But I think the causal relationship between not being permitted to hit targets inside Russia, and as a result, it's a military setback for Ukraine, that causal relationship has not been established to me. Because there are certain elements that none of us in the public can really know for sure in order to make that judgment, right? And that is really availability of US supplied missiles, for example, availability of suitable targets inside Russia, and then also trade-offs, right? War is always about trade-offs, right? If you do this, then you can't do that, right? Because they're limited resources, right? And the idea to spend a lot of resources on targets in Russia might be a very good one, but it means that you can't hit targets within Ukraine or closer to the front line. So which of the two is more important, right? Strategy is always about prioritization, right? Resources, means, ends, and so forth, right? And so the point here is that I would be very cautious from drawing conclusions about, for example, escalation fears and military strategy and what Ukraine should do and shouldn't do, and whether Ukraine would be in a much better place if it hitting at targets inside Russia would be permitted and so forth. Because I mean, these are things that we really need careful evaluation, right? And I can tell you that my understanding, at least, is, as an outside observer, having observed strikes inside Russia, I find it very difficult to find a good case how this is going to really positively affect the front line or any developments on the front line at this stage, right? Given that there seems to be a limited availability of these long-range strike capabilities. At the same time, also, the Ukrainians are obviously hitting targets there already with other capabilities, right? So my larger question is really, what is a Ukrainian theory of success for this year? And officially, it's active defense, right? That is, the Ukrainians try to actively defend the front line and build up reserves and eventually counterattack or conduct a counteroffensive at some point. I think that's fair. But my question is, can we maybe see a more systematic approach behind the front line beyond what we're seeing now in order to enable this counteroffensive, if it ever occurs, if it ever comes down the road? Are there coordination issues involved? Military power is ultimately about force employment, right? That is how you use your military forces. It's not about what weapon systems you have available, right? It's not about your resources, really. It's not about how much ammo you have at the end of the day. It's how you use whatever you have most effectively, right? And these are the questions that you need to be asking, not whether this weapon systems or that weapon system should be allowed to hit this or that target, right? It's about force employment. And force employment is really the hardest thing to evaluate. I mean, that's why I'm in Ukraine very often, right? Because you can't really evaluate that properly from social media. You can't really evaluate it just having conversations with people in Ukraine. You need to be there to see it.
Maybe we can come back a little bit later on strategy in general, because we do think, we have the discussion more in the political field, that there is an overall lack of strategy, what actually Ukraine can do, what it should do. And this lack of strategy is especially in the European Union, but also then in the US. But maybe, Ralf, since we still talk also about international law, and we know that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, he has arrest warrants against Putin and against Shoigu, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if there are other ones, especially for actually what happened in the so-called non-governmental controlled areas in the Donbass areas because of the abduction of children and other crimes. On the other hand, there is also an ICJ ruling against the war in general, which is a different thing. People, maybe you can reflect a little bit on it. But still, the problem we are facing in international communities, so the question is about the role of the international communities, that it is absolutely blocked. we know the Security Council is blocked. And so what actually do these mechanisms even mean these days? I think it's very interesting we need to talk about it. What do these mechanisms mean if we still say we want to have something which we call rules-based order, which I'm not even sure if it's still there, considering what is going on there, not only, by the way, in Ukraine, obviously also in the war of Israel against the Palestinians in Gaza. And then, which leads us then to this very, very big question about credibility, because if you talk to Indians, if you talk to Brazilians or to Indonesians, they say, why would we actually listen to you when you talk at all about human rights or international law? Because you don't care about it, you only use it once you profit from it. So what does actually these things mean? So what could they positively maybe still mean? So once, because we know they are not really enforceable, unfortunately.
That's part of my job, accepting that I'm teaching a part of law that is not really enforceable or that is being enforced by other means. It's not that there is a world police that is going to knock on your door because you did not abide by a ruling of the International Court of Justice or because you committed human rights violations. There are other consequences. So, as I said, I did want to avoid talking about the war in Gaza, but I have to say one sentence about it at least. We can still see the impact of international law when it comes, for example, to decisions whether to deliver weapons to Israel, because in some countries they are being made conditional, or there is always the condition that these weapons will only be supplied if you act in conformity with the laws of war. So there are simply other consequences than the ones that we are being used to from domestic law. As I said, it's not the police that is going to knock on your door of a state. It's not the police that is going to abduct Shoigu or Putin and send them to jail while there is a proceeding against them. It simply means that, for example, that Vladimir Putin or Shoigu cannot travel anywhere they like, and that they have somewhere in the back of their heads at least the small fear, even if it's a very small fear, but at least the fear that if they travel to one of the countries that is a member to the ICC's Rome Statute, that they might be arrested and being sent to The Hague. It's very, 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 very unlikely, but it's not completely impossible. And that by itself is already of some use and already serves at least some, even although possibly very small, purpose. At the same time, international law is in crisis. It's always been in crisis. So recently I did an interview with an former judge of the International Court of Justice, and while preparing myself for the interview, I looked up all of his publications, and I saw one of his first publications was on the crisis of international law, and I think that was back in 1980 or something. So you have this old article written by Thomas Frank in 1970, Who Killed Article 2, Paragraph 4. Article 2, Paragraph 4 is the one provision in the UN Charter that says war is illegal, or even more, the use of force is illegal. So international law is in permanent crisis. I think there has never been a time in history when people said international law is actually working perfectly and we don't have any problems whatsoever. But there are two cornerstones or two fundamental milestones in a negative sense from the last decades, and this is the year 1999 and 2003. That's when we first had these debates. Why? About the legitimacy of global institutions. First was the Kosovo intervention, the humanitarian intervention against Serbia, which is now being revived. The debate is being revived, and Russia omits the context of why there were strikes against Serbia and simply says they were illegal. Strictly legally speaking, yes, they were. There was no justification in the UN Charter regime. However, the context of the war in Kosovo is nowadays completely omitted. It's erased from history, which is also an interesting element of Russian rhetoric nowadays. They simply talk about some parts of previous episodes and completely omit the context. Why? Because context is complex and we don't want to talk about complex things. We simply want to hear that was 25 years ago, that was illegal, and that by itself is enough. And secondly was the war in Iraq, or against Iraq, 2003, when the US under George W. Bush simply completely disregarded the UN Charter regime, and it was perhaps an even deeper crisis because everyone said, okay, we have a prohibition on the use of force, and then we have the most powerful militarily, economically speaking state in the world, which doesn't give an F word about this cornerstone of the UN Charter. And that still lingers. And that still has an impact on debates today. And that's now being used, and it's not fair in debate, obviously, because you cannot justify attacking Ukraine by saying, well, you attacked Iraq 20 years ago. That's a completely different situation. But it does work in all of these debates. Why? Because you can say, again, we have a rhetorical downward spiral and say, okay, you violated first, so we will violate now again, and you are not the one to criticize us. That, by the way, is the reason why neutral countries have a voice and should use their voice, because they're the ones, like Austria, who can say, well, we didn't start the war in Iraq, we didn't start the war against Ukraine, but we're the ones who are somewhat of an impartial observer, and we're the ones who are going to point out violations of the jus ad bellum regime, regardless of who is committing them. And a previous violation in a completely different situation cannot justify an ongoing violation in Ukraine. So you cannot justify, but it does happen to some degree, and that's the absurdity of it all. But this absurdity is owed to the fact that it's complex, because we need to look at each situation by itself, evaluate on its by itself, without looking at previous situations that were completely different, where you had, for example, previous human rights violations, where you had the historic context of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also the Yugoslav dissolution wars. But that nowadays does not happen, and that's the reason why I see this, and even why today's crisis is, from my point of view, more severe than previous crises of international law, because the context is somewhat forgotten, and you have a global south that simply says, look, no one cares at all, so why should we care? And this is the last thing I want to mention here, or why should we even impose sanctions or even help, or at least say, okay, we won't assist Russia circumventing sanctions. And this is my biggest worry, that the words are still there, but putting words into deeds is not there. What do I mean by that? The words in the sense of, there is a General Assembly resolution that condemned with a large majority the war by Russia against Ukraine. But what does not exist, you have two maps. The one map where you have states voting in favor of condemning the war, there you have a large number of states, around 142, 143, the second resolution. But when it comes to implementing sanctions, the map is all of a sudden completely different. There you have the Western states implementing sanctions, and a large number of global South states, on the one hand, not only not supporting Russia circumventing them, and being opportunistic and saying, oh, now raw materials are more easily available or cheaper, we can benefit from that and simply buy them. And buying raw materials from Russia essentially means you support this war. And we have to say that also in Austria, buying gas from Russia means that we're effectively contributing money, giving money to the war purse of Russia. So that's what I meant with putting words into deeds. The words are there, the second part, not so much.
Thank you, Ralph. You said context is very complex, and I think this is something I would very much agree upon. And maybe just because I essentially think you're right, but if you talk to those countries of the so-called South, they actually often tell me in conferences and wherever, nobody actually asked us, to join the sanctions. Nobody actually discussed it with us before, and they never really thought about that we are actually dependent on Russian exports, etc. So this is something which I think is important for us at least to understand why they are not so much behind us. And maybe just one small addition to Israel, because I just think it's worth mentioning. There is also an ICC, not yet an arrest warrant, but still there is an observation ongoing against Netanyahu and a couple of his team when it comes to crimes against humanity, what they are doing there. So I think it's very difficult for us also to understand what is going on the ground there. But we are not talking about Israel and Gaza today. I just think it's difficult for us to know about all these contexts. But context, back to you, because this Russian war against Ukraine, which is now on Ukrainian soil, it obviously also is an attack on us, on the so-called West. It's an attack on the so-called global international order, which has been perceived by Russia as being unfair somehow. But they're also using, this war is maybe not yet, let's say, on the military field, but it's this so-called hybrid warfare, as we call it. We talk about disinformation. There was recently this accusation that one of the bosses of Rheinmetall was supposed to get killed by the Russians. Then there have been two German Russians who obviously wanted to attack some German and US bases in Germany, etc. So how do we actually deal with this hybrid warfare? What can we learn from this? What does this actually mean for us? And maybe, this is a very, very difficult question and a long one. What does this mean for the strategy we are lacking? I mentioned before, we don't really have a common European strategy. We have been reacting to what happened in February 2022, although we all know that it already started in 2014 when we did a little bit, but not really enough. And so then now we reacted, but there is no common strategy. The Baltics have this idea, the West, Spain has this idea. Orban has his own ideas. So, and in the middle we have this hybrid warfare. What does this mean for how could we get to a common strategy, and how should that look like if we look into the future of supporting Ukraine in general? Good luck with answering this one.
Wow, yeah, quite a bit. I mean, let's start from the top, I think, from the systemic level, so to speak, and I think it might tie into some of the things that you were talking about, the crisis of international law, and I think, you know, what got me thinking also, international law, in a sense, as we are practicing it today, can really only exist when you have essentially one or two hegemonic powers in a way that find a consensus, or you have a somewhat balanced international system based on power. That is the balance of power, for example, after the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and so forth, and the Congress system and so forth, right? The problem, though, is when you have revisionist powers or powers that really seek to upend the international system, right? And I think that's the situation that we are seeing right now, right? We have at least two powers, two greater powers, China and Russia, that are not terribly happy with the so-called liberal-based world order. And as a result, of course, they are questioning also the very fundamentals of this global liberal order that is really, in many ways, supported by U.S. military power, or at least like underwritten by U.S. military force to a certain degree. Now the issue is obviously, and for those of you who have followed the news, right, the events in the United States recently, there's been, it's fair to say, a very open debate about the future role of the United States in the world, right? Which is really a debate that the United States should have held after 1989, and it hasn't. And this is really the first time over the last few years, and I think it's fair to say I've lived many years in the United States, almost half of my life in the United States, a long time in Washington, D.C., and I worked on defense policy issues there. And it's fair to say that this consensus about the role of the United States in the world is slowly evaporating. And if that consensus is evaporating, my question would be then, what does it really mean for international institutions? And again, I have a very dim view on that, because at the end of the day, the reason why we have this international system as it is today is by and large now underwritten by the United States. It's just a fact, right? And that's also the reason why we never really had to properly think about strategy, that is prioritization within Europe, right? The United States provided this security umbrella to us, whether you like it or not. By the way, I always wish that the United States would have the power that people on the far left or far right ascribing to it, right? Because in reality, American power always has been limited to a degree. And I think a lot of people who have an understanding of military power, US military power, now that know that it's really quite finite in many ways, and that we're in a situation really where we have really, or we are moving into a much more multipolar world, right? So the problem to me on the systemic level is really that, you know, what most of you know in any case, that you have revisionist powers, Russia, China, you have a status quo power, the United States, allied with essentially Europe and a couple of other like-minded countries in the world. And the role for the like-minded countries and allies and partners of the United States is now what to do, right? If the hegemon or the person that has, the state that has provided security for us directly or indirectly over all these decades, right? Because the United States has stabilized the international system, the global commons, so to speak, right? What happens if they are no longer willing to take over that role, or if they're no longer interested in the institutions, right? And we see that to a certain degree already unfolding in Ukraine. And domestic dispute in the United States has really led to the delay of crucial military aid to Ukraine for almost half a year. That has significantly impacted the situation in the war in Ukraine. A domestic dispute in the United States. This really very much reminds me of, I don't know, the history of the late Roman Republic, right? Where you had all these disputes within the different factions in the Roman Republic, and then Egypt and all these other kingdoms somehow got affected by it. I mean, that's very much the situation these days with the United States. Now, the question is, what do we do about that? And I think the first thing, and we had in very early stages recognized that this is actually a problem. Because I don't think we really realized that this is a problem. Because if I stand here and tell you, okay, we are in a world where military conflict, war, and so forth, all of that stuff is increasingly more likely because of the systemic changes that are happening, you probably say yes, on an intellectual level you understand it, but your gut probably tells you no, that's not true. Vienna, never going to be affected, right? It's like what Gustav Mahler said, if the world goes down, I'll be in Vienna because everything here happens 20 years later, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, I don't know the exact quote. The problem is really a lack of urgency that I see. It's a lack of urgency, and it's a lack of urgency, particularly in German-speaking Europe. Mostly Germany, because it is the most important country in Europe, right? That's quite frustrating, actually, to me. And I don't think it's really going to change very much unless the United States fundamentally and critically shifts. The issue here is, though, that this change, as with most historical processes, is going to take a long time, right? It's already there. You can recognize the contours, and it's going to be a process that already kicked off. But I think it's an inevitable process that the United States will no longer be able to provide as much security as they used to for Europe and the European Union and NATO. And I think that the importance of NATO as a result is also going to decline. So my professional opinion now as a military analyst is that we just need to do our homework. First and foremost, strengthen our military capabilities at the national level, right? That's something that we need to do. And then in order to combat hybrid threats, which, by the way, any future war involving Russia, this is obviously something that Austria, Germany, all these countries that are so-called in the so-called strategic rear of any potential fight with Russia, this is really something that we will need to be able to deal with, right? Because any sort of military campaign of Russia against NATO in the future will entail attacks on rail networks. It will entail attacks on critical infrastructure. It will entail disinformation campaigns. It will include cyber attacks and so forth. It will try to really exploit all of our weaknesses in a democratic society. And I think the answer obviously can never be just militarily. I think that's the first step. But on the wider scale, it's really about our educational system. It's about, how we consume media, news and so forth. It's a large field. By the way, that's the reason why I don't very much like this expression hybrid warfare, because one never quite knows what one means with it, right? Is it sabotage? Is it cyber operations? Is it critical infrastructure attacks and so forth? I would like to be very specific, but then I realize I know why people are using it and why it's in many national strategies, security strategies. So yes, I think for me the most important thing is to recognize that we should have a sense of urgency, that there is a systemic change happening. And that we need to address it. And the first step of doing that is really strengthen, essentially, our military response to this. Because ultimately, whether a nation stands or falls very often is the result of military power. It's just how it is in history.
I also don't like the term hybrid warfare, but I just didn't know how to summarize all these issues you mentioned, just by not being too long. I have one more question afterwards for you, but maybe you can also reflect a little bit on what he just said, and maybe also on this, sorry I say it again, hybrid warfare. What does it mean from an international law point of view? Ivan Krastev said recently in December at the FUME event, how is the West going to win a war where we think we are not participating? And we kind of are, not militarily, but in these other areas, be it economics, be it space, be it whatever, be it on the internet, be it on wherever, academia, you name it. So nevertheless, from a law point of view, how would you assess this situation? I know it's a tough one as well.
Yeah, and I like the term. I do like the term because it's a way of sounding smart, and you don't have to explain yourself because you know that everyone else has a different understanding of the term hybrid war. And everyone's like, oh, that sounds fancy, and no one really knows what you mean. So it's an easy way, just like using Latin phrases of sounding smart. And here, that's why I wanted to jump in, and I'm sorry about that, is because the law does play a role in exactly this situation when it comes to exactly this concept. Why? Because it's not a legal concept. You won't find it in any UN charter, in the UN Charter, in any of the Geneva Conventions. There is no reference whatsoever to hybrid warfare. Why? Because we look at each situation separately and say, okay, there's an attempt to kill the CEO of Rheinmetall. Okay, human rights law question, arbitrary deprivation and targeted killing, perhaps, so assassination, so violation of the right to life. Is that a use ad bellum? Is that the use of force against the state? Probably not, because for that you need something more. Or we could debate whether trying to assassinate a leader of a state, prime minister, president, whether that's actually force. We do have some state practice here. We have the attempt on the life of Herbert Walker Bush after, however, he was no longer president, when he was no longer president, where there was some indication that states are ready to say killing a former president can be considered as low level, but still the use of force. Killing an acting president, although you kill only one person, can certainly be considered as the use of force against the state. Disinformation campaign, obviously not the use of force, but perhaps a violation of the non-intervention principle. Sabotage, here again, you could say, well, probably not the use of force because the level of force is often not met, but definitely a violation of the non-intervention principle. Or, last but not least, when it comes to Ukraine, politicians sometimes saying the war started in 2022. Every international lawyer would say, no, it actually started because this was indirect use of force, plus also because of the support for so-called rebels, or whatever you want to call them, or separatists or secessionist parties in Ukraine, but sending them weapons is indirect force, plus being directly present in eastern Ukraine, because there were Russian soldiers already long before February 2022, also means there is direct force. So, and by the way, the term war is nowadays no longer a legal term. We use the terms force and international or non-international armed conflict. So it has an ordering function. And last but not least, the last example to be mentioned here is the debate in Germany, the question about, are we now a party to the conflict, a Kriegspartei? Here, international once again had an ordering function to tell people, if Germany is sending weapons to Ukraine, that does not mean that Germany becomes a party to the conflict. And we have decades of state practice clearly establishing that merely sending weapons does never mean that you are actively becoming a party to a conflict. And by the way, even if you're a party to the conflict, legally speaking, it is still not allowed to attack you, because that's not the essential question. It's a 19th century debate that was instrumentalized for political purposes and revived during the early 21st century. So we can also see an instrumentalization of international law, but international law itself can play an ordering function, in particular when it comes to these difficult to define concepts such as hybrid warfare. I do have one question for you, Stephanie, however, since I know that you're much more often in contact with people from non-Western countries. I always know that there is a criticism of what they do not like, but did it ever occur to you that did someone actually came up with a thesis of what they want the world to look like instead? Or do they always complain that we do not like the Western dominated order? Or is there something constructive in the sense of, okay, we want the revival of, I don't know, the conference system of Vienna 1814, 1815 and the decades afterwards? Did it ever occur to you that someone said, we want the world to look like this, instead of simply saying we do not want it to look like this? You know?
It does occur to me, what they want is obviously more power for them, and they don't want to choose sides. This is actually what I normally get from them, They don't want to be on this or on that side. So, like many of these states do have like a foreign policy, which is like kind of a swing policy. Good relations with them, depending on...
Sounds pretty Austrian to me.
It does, yeah. And on the other hand, what they also say is, they obviously they don't want to be dragged into what they perceive as our wars. This is something what they literally say, it's not our war, we don't want to be dragged in, not with sanctions, not with that. We do what we want, so we just don't want to be under the umbrella, because they have this feeling that they have been, it's not that I support it, but it's just like what I get from them, so that they have the feeling that they have been somehow coerced into this liberal world order, and yeah, you know the other stories. One more question, and then I go into the audience. You can already prepare your questions, because Germany was mentioned a couple of times, and at least I was a bit surprised with this recent let's say, announcement that Germany is going to deploy middle-range missiles again on German soil, U.S. missiles on German soil, and there wasn't a debate. So even though we understand, because he said we need to care for our deterrence, it's defense, but whatever. What I was lacking, because I was reminded in '79, the NATO Doppelbeschluss, what is the English word for it, and this is only part of it, because there is no double Beschluss there, it's only so the risk of deterrence not embedding into something which could also lead to kind of an escalation when it comes to an arms race. I mean, how would you assess this situation? Because I didn't feel that there was a debate, at least, about it.
Yes, and that's a very interesting question, and something that I've been working on for many years, and that is really about the future force structure of the United States Armed Forces. And it's very interesting. I found this debate extremely interesting that occurred last week in Germany, because this is really a change that has been in the making for 4 or 5 years now. There was advance notification that the United States would deploy what's known as a multi-domain task force. That's a fancy word for a new military unit that the United States Army has stood up, or they are standing up multiple multi-domain task forces in the Pacific and in Europe. And the idea or the main job of these task forces is essentially help with supporting combat formations at the front line with deep strikes, long-range strikes, that is missile strikes deep into the rear of the enemy, target command posts, command and control nodes, logistical nodes, also maybe second echelon troops that are moving up at the front line, right? And the reason why this was developed is essentially because Europe and the United States, in comparison to China and Russia, are conventionally speaking, in terms of quantity of numbers and systems, that is weapon systems in place, inferior, right? So if you're a military planner, a force planner, you think about what can I do to overcome that, right? And you come up with technological solutions, one of which is this multi-domain task force that integrates cyber capabilities, long-range strike capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities, and so forth. It's essentially how the US Armed Forces envision the future of warfare. Long-range strikes. Now, the problem, and you brought that up. Oh, by the way, and I should say, the interesting aspect about the debate in Germany is that that it happened sort of in an information vacuum about the US Armed Forces, right? Because automatically the first people who went on television and who were informing the public about it said, well, it's about Kaliningrad and it's about countering mid-range, short-range Iskander ballistic missiles of the Russians, nuclear-tipped missiles. So they automatically put it into the nuclear deterrence category, right? Because immediately people were thinking about the 1980s as if the time stopped, which to me was quite instructive about where the German strategic culture is actually, right? Everything sort of goes back to the 1980s, I very much find. Anything quickly goes back to, oh my God, they can attack us with nuclear weapons and so forth, right? Anything, all the roads in German strategic culture usually lead to nuclear war in one way or the other. And that sort of, I don't like the argument very often with a lot of countries about self-deterrence. I do think in the case of Germany, that expression of self-deterrence is still very much warranted. I mean, you had Chernobyl, you had all these other issues. Germany was a frontline state during the Cold War. I totally understand it. In this case, though, I think it prevents a good debate from happening. Because I think we're going to face this, the West, the United States are going to face the same issue in the Pacific with the deployment of these long-range units. Why? Because if you deploy these systems, these mid-range systems, by the way, which only could be deployed to Germany because the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, expired back in 2019, I believe, which prevented the stationing, the deployment of ground-based ballistic and cruise missiles from 500 kilometers.
No? It didn't really expire, no, it was the INF. It was broken by...
Russia, sorry.
It was broken by the US because they claimed that Russia actually broke it before. So,
yeah, I mean, it's a Well, you're right. Thanks for correcting. Yeah, right. It's about a system that the United States. It's pretty conclusive that the Russians violated it, and there's some debate that the SM-6 on the American side also has a ground-to-ground capability. That is, that it not only shoots down airplanes, but it can also shoot at ground targets and so forth. But in any case, the issue is that these weapon systems now can be deployed, and I do think it's a debate worth having to what degree this can lead to vertical escalation. Vertical escalation means essentially you are escalating a conflict potentially to the nuclear level, right? And I think you can have a good discussion, a fair argument about whether this is really the concept, the warfighting concept that the United States and NATO wants to go with in the future, right? The problem is that the Russians and the Chinese are exactly working on the same. They also see the future of warfare premised on these long-range strike capabilities, ground-launched long-range strike capabilities, right? So you have two sides that essentially will have large missile arsenals in the future, and they can fire at each other with conventional warheads. But how do you know that they're conventional and nuclear tipped, right? And that's going to be a problem in many ways. And the issue here is, on the one hand, it hasn't even been on the radar within European NATO members. Trust me, I've been involved in these debates and talked to people. It has not been on the radar. People just fundamentally didn't understand what this multi-domain task force is really doing, what its capabilities are. I mean, they've got a piece of paper probably that outlined all of this stuff, right? And but still, the potential impact it could have on the Russians, I don't think was properly appreciated, because they never probably dealt with the warfighting concept surrounding it, right? And on the other hand, you have the United States, obviously, as the largest member state, the most powerful member state of NATO, not imposing, but influencing also the development of other warfighting concepts, including the NATO warfighting concept, with these long-range strike capabilities and multi-domain task force focused capabilities. And on paper, from a military perspective, they make absolutely sense. But I think there's a disconnect very often between operational concepts in the military and the political level of decision making, and then the overall strategic situation. And I think it's particularly acute and dangerous when you have two nuclear-armed adversaries facing each other off with conventional capabilities. And we've never had that test, right? In the 1980s, and then I'm going to stop, but it's instructive. There's a whole military culture in the United States, particularly in the US Army, surrounding these long-range strike capabilities, because essentially the United States always had this problem that its forces, from a quantity perspective, were inferior to the Warsaw Pact, to the Soviet Union, so they always tried to come up with new technological ways to counter Soviet military superiority. And in the late 1970s and early 1980s, they came up with what's known as air-land battle. That's a military doctrine. And essentially what we're seeing now is air-land battle 2.0 in a way. And in the American mindset, and among many NATO countries, the goal for, in 1991, the one-sided victory of essentially the United States Cold War military and NATO against a Soviet-equipped military, the Iraqi army, sort of proved air-land battle right, because it was very few casualties on the Allied side, the Americans and its allies and supporters, and the Iraqi army got completely destroyed, right? And I think there's a certain myth surrounding this idea of air-land battle. And that's why it's so strong. Again, on paper, it makes sense, these long-range strike capabilities, but it has an impact on strategic stability. I just would be cautious to immediately look at it through the nuclear lens, because these capabilities are actually here to stay, because this is really the future of warfare, how the United States envisions it. So I think it's important to have this debate in the policy community, not just in Germany, but really broadly across NATO, and how to deal with it. Because I think the biggest danger is miscalculation. And I think it really will have to involve also to open up a dialogue with Russia, frankly.
Thank you very much. Very good answer. Yes, we have time for questions. We will collect a couple. We start here first, and then there, and then we can do 2 rounds, and there and then in the back, and then we do a second round, and I see you two already. If possible, be very brief. Paul, there. Maybe introduce, and if it's a specific question to a specific person,
yes,
please say.
My name is
brief. Yeah.
Leo Gabriel, an expert on Latin America. What you said in the beginning insinuates in some way that there must be a logical drive of the Ukrainians towards a ceasefire, negotiations, because negotiations is not from one day to another, it takes months and perhaps years. Did you feel any of this either in the population or in governmental circles that they would like to have this ceasefire? That is one question. And the other question is, because you mentioned several times the Vienna Congress, is there, you think, would it be a good idea to repeat the Vienna Congress, why not in Vienna, to have the security zones, a security deal of zones of influence and of all these, to get the military perspective of conflict into a political one?
Thank you very much. Here in the second row.
Hello, my name is Andre Goodfriend, a former American diplomat. My question is primarily directed, I think, toward Dr. Janik. We've been talking about international law in the post-World War II context, the United Nations, the international institutions that are primarily focused on territorial integrity. There's been a change in that time in Europe and the United States with regard to the rise of ethno-nationalist parties who see a role in states safeguarding their fellow ethnic groups in other states. That was part of Russia's justification for safeguarding the Russian ethnic minority in Ukraine. Do you think that the change within Europe and in the United States, exemplified in the recent parliamentary elections, where the third largest party group now essentially takes on that platform of ethnic identity, do you think that that will lead to a change in the concept of international law with regard to safeguarding ethnic minorities versus territorial integrity?
Thank you. In the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your very interesting insights. My name's Ron Willis. I'm president of the Club of Commercial Councillors here in Austria. Either I misunderstood some things, but I have felt that there were a few contradictions in what you were saying on the strategic side. I think you made a comment, it's not a matter of the weapons that the Ukrainians have and how much, it's a matter of how you use them. To me, that maybe was a bit simplistic because I think they need everything. I think they need the right weapons, they need the right amount, and they also know how to use them. As examples, if Britain and the US hadn't equipped the Ukrainians with shoulder-launched missiles at the beginning, I would say it would have been all over by now. One problem the Ukrainians obviously have at the moment is that we can supply them with all of the defensive missiles that we can, and that will probably never be enough. But as long as the Russians can sit back in their own territory and then launch weapons from back in their own territory without the Ukrainians being able to do anything about that, I think they're sitting in a rather poor situation. And then you went on to talk about the Western strategy is now, well, okay, we set up these long-range attack groups or whatever you call them. Isn't that exactly what the Ukrainians need? They're in the situation where they're the minority partner. They have a lack of equipment. They have a lack of manpower. Isn't that exactly what they need? What bothers me, if I may just add another dimension to this, I've been to a number of different discussions on this, and I've heard statements by European leaders saying, oh, we think in 10 years we're going to have our military strength up to the level it should be. Do they think President Putin's going to wait 10 years for them? And I would use an example for this. If the British hadn't doubled their air force at the beginning of the Second World War, they would have lost the Battle of Britain for sure. If they hadn't massively increased their sea transport capacity to start with it within also months, to start getting enough material from America, they would have starved. Aren't we in the same situation? Sorry, we just don't seem to be able to ramp up to what's needed. And you talk about Rheinmetall, you might have some more insight. Are they really ramping up to where they can do something to help the situation? I'd appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Right behind you. Right behind you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you, panelists, for your explanation. My name is Yuri Krivanos. I am former director of the United Nations Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament in Asia and the Pacific. Now I am UN retiree. And I would like to start by saying that about one month ago, Putin fired his Minister of Defense, Shoigu. A new minister is Andrei Belousov. During this period of time, we witnessed attacks against children's hospital, against all energetic infrastructure, against civilian people, and so on and so forth. So International Court of Justice now is in a position, is right, to issue another order on the prosecution of a new Minister of Defense. Second, it was rightly mentioned by Dr. I forgot your name.
Janik.
Forgive
Janik.
me. Yeah, that there is a lack of support to the Ukrainian position, especially from the global south. Because we are talking about the terrorist war, about the conflict, crisis, like many countries like to say. But I think we should give a clear definition of this war. It is a colonial war. Ukraine used to be a part of the Russian Empire since mid of 17th century. Now Ukraine got its independence. For Russia is unacceptable. Therefore they go against, and the initial goal of Russia was to liberate. To liberate whom and from whom? This is a point. Sorry, it's important issue. And now I would like to elaborate a little bit what this gentleman said.
Sorry, we don't have time for that.
No.
I agree.
Please,
agree the points are
it's a different, different question.
But
different
those
question.
were not questions so far, but you're right. But please be very brief. Please be very brief, because
Okay.
we still have another
Many
question.
countries who are partners and suppliers of main weapons, like Germany, US, UK now, they don't allow Ukraine to use this weapon beyond 200 or 300 kilometers. Do you know how the Russians use their bombers and missiles against Ukraine? Their airplane take off from their airfields on the distance of 1,000 kilometers, then flight, then launch their rockets. If we have these weapons like Atacams, German, English, we can use these missiles against airfield.
Thank you.
Targets are identified.
Thank
it is
you.
not a problem.
Thank you. I think we touched a little bit upon it, and I get the point, but yeah. Who would like to start? We can do a short second round, because I have another. Who would like to start?
All right, I'll try to be as brief as possible, and I fully understand the emotion, and I think we maybe have some time afterwards as well, also for everyone else. I don't want to go home already anyhow. Why did I speak about the Congress of Vienna? Because I think there is a historic parallel. I always try to find, for the purpose of orientation, to find historic parallels. The only parallel that I could think of, where you have a world with different centers of power, was the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars. So after the Congress system, 1814, 1815, the Congress of Vienna, Congress of Laibach, and so on and so forth. With the big difference that nowadays it would be a truly global system. Back then it was a European system of the European powers, and now we would perhaps have a global concept of powers. Meaning that international law would change, and all of a sudden these old textbooks are more relevant than the new textbooks, because that means that war can ultimately be a way of settling political disputes. That's the big fear that I have, but at the same time, and this is more of an IR question, of international relations question, it seems as if our system, this system of the balance of power, that's the less stable one, but however the more likely one. Western decline, we now even have a vice president who is openly endorsing the view that the US is a declining power. He said that explicitly. And this is what he bases his views on, and saying he's not an isolationist, but he's saying we have to focus on the battles that matter to us most. And Ukraine, as he said openly, Ukraine does not matter to us. Honestly, I don't care about what happens in Ukraine. That's his, I don't know exact words, but the essence of his words. And we've been there around, if I do the math, 83 years ago. There is a book, if I'm not mistaken, by Stephen Wertheim, Tomorrow the World. When we talk about the World War II, we talk about 1939 as the beginning of the Second World War, and 1941 as the attack on Pearl Harbor, US entering the war. The year that is somewhat neglected is the year 1940. Why? Because this is the year when Nazi Germany successfully conquered significant parts of France, and you had in the US an intense debate, what do we do? And this debate is relevant now today. Why? Because there were, and were not fringe opinions. There were a lot of policymakers who said, maybe we have to accept a division of spheres of influence, meaning that Nazi Germany and Soviet Union dividing Europe among themselves. We have America, not the America that people often confuse with all of America. Like, we have America with Latin and Central America as our backdoor, our geopolitical backdoor. And Asia Pacific, also none of our concern. So spheres of influence and spheres of interest. And this is the debate that is somewhat now perhaps going to come back. But that means for Europe that we are also essentially none of the, and I quote Donald Trump in his debate with Joe Biden, the one debate where he said there is an ocean between us. So why should we care about what happens in Europe? And he says that openly. Could be saying Europe is none of our geopolitical sphere of interest. Why should we care what happens in Ukraine? Plus, there is an ocean between us. These are the two key phrases that we should all keep in our minds when we talk about Europe, and whether we are an independent actor or just someone else's sphere of influence. I'm sorry, I was way too long answering the first question, but it's always when you get paid for talking, you end up talking way too much. So before answering the second question, I would give up the microphone to Franz.
Yes, I hope I can answer all the questions. The first one was also whether, or that was not...
Ceasefire and negotiations was one?
Yes, the negotiations. The short answer is currently I don't have the impression that the Ukrainian government is interested in negotiations for the simple reasons because the Russian government is not interested in it, and because both sides still think that there are military options that they can exploit on the battlefield. But it is really primarily a Russian decision here to enter negotiations, and the Russians really have no interest whatsoever at the moment because they're on the upswing on the battlefield. They're making incremental gains. They feel they have a window of opportunity at least until the end of 2025, after which their combat capabilities most likely are going to decline just in terms of because of their defense industrial base. So I think it's going to be a while until we'll see serious negotiations, independent, by the way, of what is happening in the United States and who is going to sit in the White House in January 2024, in my opinion. I have not seen any indication in the population, and we talked to a fair bit of people that they would be willing to enter negotiations now, yeah, including the troops on the front line. I mean, it's really a situation where they just don't see a possibility at the moment. That can change. These things also can quickly change. In 3 months from now, maybe I have a different impression. This is the impression that I have at this moment. When it comes to another Congress of Vienna, yeah, I mean, I always like stories about the Congress of Vienna and like to see a second version of it. But I don't think it's going to be particularly useful in this instance, because we do have under other mechanisms in place that could potentially work here. The third question.
It was about the weapons, not how much, but how to use them, long range. The question.
Yes, yes.
Time.
So I should have been much clearer in my language here. I said it's not, military power is not exclusively dependent on quantity of material available, weapon systems, and ammunition and so forth, and that really, in a tactical situation or on the battlefield, it's really mostly about force employment, and overall it's still mostly about force employment, but of course you need a healthy level of ammunition and weapon systems and other capabilities in order to actually have the chance to deploy your forces in the right and most effective manner. So I do think, obviously, that this is quite important. I have noticed that this idea about essentially only permitting Ukraine to fight with one hand tied behind its back, that's something that I always encounter, and that's something also that I have conversations about in Ukraine with soldiers on the front line, with policymakers and so forth. And I think it is a valid debate to be had. And I do think, yes, I don't think there should be any restrictions on these weapon systems. But how should I phrase it? I think like it might have less to do with actually the West or the United States or Germany being afraid of escalation on behalf of Russia. And perhaps it has to do something, as I said, about how the Ukrainians are actually using these systems and how effective they really are. As I said, it is always about trade-offs. And these airfields that have been mentioned are targets, yes, they can be hit. But as we know from past examples, it usually takes the Russians around 48 hours to about a week to adapt again. So you're only going to shift the problem to some other areas. Don't be under the illusions that if tomorrow the Americans permit ATACMS strikes, that this is going to have a significant impact on the battlefield. It will not. It will have an impact for 2 or 3 days. The issues here are much more structural. And what will you have accomplished? You will have wasted precious ATACMS ammunition, which perhaps, and I'm only saying perhaps, you could use somewhere else more effectively. Again, war is always a trade-off between bad choices and worse choices, right? And in that sense, I don't want to say what the right course of action here is. I just want to say it's usually not monocausal, all these issues that we're debating when it comes to the war in Ukraine. European forces in 10 years, yes, it's a big issue. I think we're lucky if it's going to take us only a decade to catch up. I think companies like Rheinmetall are doing good work. They're probably going to increase their ammo production significantly by the end of 2025. I do think that Ukraine will not have as much of a disadvantage in ammunition down the road for the duration of this war as it already had, for example, during the summer of 2022, where the Russian advantage on occasion was really around 8-1 or sometimes even 11-1 in terms of artillery shells fired. And I don't think Russia will gain a decisive fires advantage in this war. And I think that's a good thing for Ukraine. So I do think we are slowly increasing our production capacity in Europe and in the United States. But of course, I'm not sure whether it's enough, particularly when it comes to interceptors, air defense interceptors, and long-range missiles. And then about the multi-domain task force and the U.S. concept of multi-domain operations with long-range strikes, I should say this is in support. In military terms, this is called the deep battle, fighting the deep battle, right? That is fighting a battle behind the actual front line. You can only make that work, though, if you closely coordinate it with fighting in the close battle, right? Because everything in military terms, like in everything else in life, has to be well coordinated in order to have a good effect, right? And my issue that I have, not just in Ukraine, but with other armed forces as well, that this coordination between the deep battle and the close battle is really tricky. And again, there are sometimes trade-offs. If you invest in deep battle capabilities, you might not have enough close battle capabilities. I mean, and this is somebody like what I do, right? I think about these things. How do you divide a force up that you have capabilities for close battle and capabilities for deep battle? Essentially. And so the Ukrainians obviously need to have deep battle capabilities, and they have them, and they're allowed to use them against Crimea, for example. So one strategy could potentially be drop what you're doing in Russia and really focus, for example, exclusively on Crimea in order to create a massive effect there. And I did like also the reference to the Battle of Britain and the fact that I think it was Stephen Baldwin actually, which sort of went under the prime minister right before Chamberlain, who started or kickstarted the British defense industrial base, right, to prepare it for the Battle of Britain. And the Brits were extremely lucky because they got exactly the type of battle that they had prepared for, and that's why they won it at the end of the day, right? They exactly prepared for this type of fight during in 1940, And it was very prescient by them. And I wish that we also would have that foresight within the European Union, but also the West at large, to properly prepare for possible contingencies. Is there another question? No, right, from my end?
I mean, there was the one about the lack of support from the South and the colonial war.
The lack of, I think that's more for... Or for you, maybe.
Or for you, yeah. Just a few words about ethno-nationalism. That by itself is also not a new phenomenon or a new question. The first so-called protection of nationals doctrine example is from the year 1823 in Creta. So in nowadays Greece, back then Ottoman Empire, interventions on behalf or in the name of Christian minorities living in the Ottoman Empire. So that by itself is not new. The idea is not new. We saw it then again in 1860 after the Maronite massacre in present-day Syria, back then still part of the Ottoman Empire, and present-day Lebanon. So that by itself is an old concept which was used by the European powers with the interesting side aspect that they coordinated among themselves. So it was not unilateral in the sense that France intervened in the Ottoman Empire, or intervened. It was actually a protection of nationals military mission in the name of Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire. But before that, they went as part of the Council of Europe to the and talked and communicated with the other European powers and said, okay, we are going to intervene in the Ottoman Empire to protect Christians there. So that by itself is not new. What is new, however, is the way Russia is using it nowadays. So they also already used it in Georgia. They said, we have to protect Russian minorities, and Russia is doing a very good job at instrumentalizing international law and policy concepts, because they say there is the responsibility to protect. We now use the responsibility to protect Russian minorities in Georgia, or now Russian minority in Ukraine. So they use international law concepts or international policy concepts and abuse it to legitimize their wars. But this is by itself not an old concept. What is new, however, is that nowadays the principle of territorial integrity is enshrined in the UN Charter and universally accepted. And the principle of the protection of nationals doctrine is now no longer applicable to protect minorities, either because they're really under danger or because there is some made-up threat to them. But nowadays, it's only confined to these very rare circumstances where a low number of people is actually in danger. So, for example, hijacking of planes and Entebbe. That would be one casebook example of a protection of nationals doctrine application, where you would say, okay, you make it something like this, like a surgical, like an operation. You simply detract your own nationals, protect them from imminent danger, but not more. You don't start a full-blown war. So the concept itself has changed. And last but not least, only one word about colonial war. Russia is doing a good job at pretending it's the Soviet Union. And they say they remind global South countries, remember who was on your side when you were back then colonies or so-called newly independent states. The Soviet Union was always an international forum on your side, and we are somewhat of the successor state of the Soviet Union. So they're still reviving the remnants of the Soviet Union, and they're doing a good job at that by saying, okay, look, we're practically, not legally, but practically identical because we're the successor state to the Soviet Union. And that's the problem here, that the whole colonialism debate, I wholeheartedly agree. This is also colonialism. This is a different type of colonialism because it doesn't pass the so-called saltwater test. But colonialism can also be something that is not above your sea borders, because that's the saltwater test. It means that you colonize people who are separated from you via saltwater, via an ocean, because of an ocean. But however, the colonialism debate is used in the exact opposite direction by Russia. They say, we were your friends back when you were still colonized, and we still are your friends today, and now this is a different type of colonialism, and we're fighting on your side against still Western-dominated colonialism. That's why it is such a explosive, I would say even an explosive concept, colonialism, and it's very hard to convince global South countries saying, look, this is also colonialism, because they would say, no, we suffered colonialism, this might be something different, maybe imperialism, but it's not colonialism. So I would be careful using this word, although I fully understand why it is being used, but it comes with the danger that global South countries would say, now you're even taking away colonialism from us, pretending you're also victims of colonialism.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time, but Christos was first, and then Angela, and then Mirjana, and then that's it. But you might be a little bit around for later as well. We start with Angela. Yeah.
Angela Kane, I'm the Vice President of the IIP. Fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. I want to come back to the very first part when you started out, Franz-Stefan, and you talked about the lack of strategy, if I remember correctly, in Ukraine. And I thought that that was a very interesting comment because I fully agree that I don't really see it. Now, it's very hard to have a strategy if A, you don't know how many people get killed every month, you don't know how many people you're going to be able to recruit again, even though you said the recruitment drive was successful and has now shown results after 6 months. And also, you don't know exactly what weapons you're going to have and when they're going to be delivered. But I think the most important issue that really comes up is, again, and I want to come back to the technology aspect, and that is Ukraine cannot fight without technology. And I don't mean the weapons necessarily, but I mean Starlink by Elon Musk. Elon Musk has just today or yesterday announced he's going to give $25 million or $45 million a month to Trump. Now, I am pretty certain by now that Trump is going to get reelected. And as you said, the saltwater test, Trump must have heard about it. There's an ocean between us, right? So basically, if he pulls the cord, what is going to happen? Now, you talked, both of you, about negotiation. I don't know how much of a negotiation there's a possibility. Then who is going to do that? Is it only the Ukrainians? I mean, what is going to put together? So let me ask you and both of you from the legal side also, what can you actually expect? What's going to happen come end of this year or early next year if there's a change in the US? Because the Europeans are not able to fill the void that the US withdrawal would leave.
Thank you very much. Christos Katsoulis, I'm heading the Friedrich Ebert Foundation here. Lots of questions, but I'm putting a short one. You mentioned that 2025, you mentioned the war on attrition, Franz-Stefan, and I wanted to ask, a war of attrition needs the ability to regenerate manpower as well as material. And how do you compare Russia and Ukraine on that? You said irrespective of what happens in the US, 2025 might be a tipping point due to the defense capabilities of Russia. Where are these tipping points from your point of view in Ukraine and Russia? How can we accelerate the tipping points in Russia and somehow avoid tipping points in Ukraine?
My name is Mirjana Tomic. I work for Presse Club Concordia. I'm a host and moderator of debates like this. And I have several very short questions. One question for you is, well, I'm a bit curious, how do you get to the front line? Because journalists cannot get. My colleagues don't get to the front line anymore. Even some Ukrainian photographers who have been photographing the war are not under, how do you get there? So I can tell my colleagues from The Economist and other papers. So that's
Economist is getting to the front line.
not for a long time. Then second question is, how do you envision this Ukrainian victory? And who is going to negotiate at the end? Whether it is next year, or is it going to be Moscow and Washington? Is Kiev going to be involved, and how? And for Janik, I have a very short comment. I promise it will be short. You're talking about Global South. I don't know about the Global South, but I lived for 12 years in Mexico and one in Guatemala. I cannot think of any Mexican who thinks that the United States intervenes to spread democracy, because that's not their history. So I'm just wondering, how would you involve a Mexican or a Brazilian or someone from El Salvador to join forces and to think about Ukraine as their war? As Ivan Krastev said at my event that Stephanie mentioned, Ukraine is a European war and Gaza is an international war. This was a quote from Ivan Krastev, not my idea. Thank you.
Would like to start? Ralph, maybe you?
Yeah, because my answer is much shorter. I don't know. I also don't know anything about the other questions. The only thing that I know is, and this is where I can fall back to, is there is actually a legal obligation not to support countries that are engaged in a war. And at the same time, I know that this has become a dead letter. But essentially, we have First, 1945, in the prohibition of the use of force, and secondly, in the work of the International Law Commission, which is a subsidiary organ of the United Nations General Assembly, in its draft articles on state responsibility said, first, do not commit violations of international law yourself, and second, do not support such violations, either deliberately or also, and that's the question here, is that an emerging norm or an existing norm, but at least do everything you can not to support them, by buying gas or raw materials, and even work together to, in the case of the most severe violations of international law, so-called jus cogens norms. As I said, using Latin phrases makes you seem smarter than you actually are, meaning that these are so-called peremptory norms, norms that may never be violated. And a treaty, for example, that would violate such a peremptory norm, prohibition of slavery, prohibition of torture, prohibition of genocide, and war of aggression is invalid ab initio. Latin again. I tried desperately to sound smart, sorry. But meaning that the treaty is from the very beginning illegal or null and void and does not operate. So we do have this legal obligation, but at the same time, as you correctly point out, why should someone in Mexico say, look, we are in so-called in WTO law terms, developing country, if there is an opportunity to get cheaper resources, why should we care about a war that is happening somewhere completely different? And all I can offer, and it's not much, is phrases such as, look, this is a global norm and our whole international system rests on this global norm, that you may not start any war unless it's authorized by the Security Council or you're defending yourself. But when you're defending yourself, you're not even starting a war. But this is all we have. Some global south countries have realized that. If I'm not mistaken, it was the representative of Kenya in the Security Council, who pointed out that this, although it's happening somewhere completely different, but nevertheless affects us, because if this fundamental rule is evaporating, that has an effect on everyone, because then every state can start a war and simply say, look, there is no rule prohibiting it. We're back in the 19th century when countries could always start a war as a continuation of politics by other means. It's not much, but that's all I can offer from an international law point of view.
Yes, let me also try to be very quick to address the question about the Ukrainian strategy or theory of success and victory. As I said, I think the prevailing strategy right now is active defense, and the idea is really to actively defend the front line and build up reserves and eventually go on the offensive again. Now that's in theory the case, or at least the idea how Ukraine essentially wants to victoriously conclude this war. I don't know much beyond that, and I really don't want to speculate what a potential theory of victory could look like. I just think we need to be realistic, or the West needs to be realistic what can be accomplished and what can't be accomplished. And to me, I think what's most important, no matter what strategy the Ukrainians are picking, there has to be unity of effort behind it. And this is really the most crucial element of it. And it really has to be a strategy that can adequately be sourced as well, resourced as well. And beyond that, whether it's going to be another counteroffensive or whether it's going to be a combination of various counterattacks and combined with a long-range strike campaign on Crimea, or whether it's just an offensive in being strategy, essentially, where you threaten Russia with an attack, build up your capabilities, and essentially say, well, do you want to go to the negotiation table, or do you want to really face this new military onslaught after Ukraine has built up its forces? So I think there are larger questions in place, but I have to say that's not uncommon in war, that you try to find a new strategy in the middle of a conflict, right? This didn't work out, so we tried this. Usually happens all the time. That's why war goals, war aims constantly shift also. You rarely end a war with the same goals that you, for the same goals that you entered it. Sometimes, of course, it happens, but not as often as you would imagine. So I think the larger question is, what's the right theory of success? And I don't have a good answer for you that when it comes to inflection points in this war of attrition, I do think we have to realize that Russian military resources are not infinite. particularly when it comes to armored vehicles. There's going to be a drop in the availability once Soviet-era stocks are running low by the end of 2025, 2026. Once that happens, I think Russian ability to conduct ground operations, it's going to be degraded to a certain degree. It's not going to be completely wiped out, but it's going to be much more difficult for the Russians to sustain the current rate of operations in Ukraine. There are other smaller details that potentially could pose issues for the Russian defense industry, the lack of barrel productions, for example, but also lack of components for other weapon systems that they have. So, and then of course there's the larger question about the Russian economy. I'm not an economist, so I can't really comment on that in detail, but there are going to be challenges for Russia down the road, right? And for the Ukrainians, I think the inflection point, I mean, one of the major inflection points is currently happening as we speak. It's the manpower issue. The manpower issue is probably the most important issue that Ukraine will need to address. It has been amplified in severity because the West has delivered late some of the weapon systems, ammunition, and it is extremely difficult. We've heard that on the front line multiple times. It is very difficult to plan ahead in terms of how much ammo you use per week or month. So do you have enough for this attack if you don't really know what's coming the next week, right? So there is an issue with getting deliveries to Ukraine on time. Like a fairly predictable amount to individual frontline units. This is an issue. But apart from that, I do think that the situation from a material perspective for Ukraine is going to stabilize, perhaps with the exception of air defenses. And this is something where really NATO and partners of Ukraine are making a concerted effort to address these issues. Interceptors that are needed to essentially guarantee that Ukrainian air defenses make it through the winters, and additional systems. And there are talks and measures put in place to guarantee that, and hopefully they're going to be successful. I think the key is for Ukraine to hold the front line overall, not suffer a lot of losses holding it, and at the same time be able to build up reserves in order at some point to go on the offensive again, or to at least threaten another offensive, and then have a more concerted, deep battle strike campaign against Russia, and then we'll see. Of course, external factors, the election in the United States, are going to play a role. Starlink is probably the most critical capability that the Ukrainians have. I said that already 2 years ago already. Essentially, the entire way of war for Ukraine is premised on the availability of Starlink or an equivalent to Starlink. There are alternatives out there, and some units are using alternatives to Starlinks, but the scale now of Starlink usage is in such a way that it's very difficult to replace it. So I think, yes, could potentially be a vulnerability if Elon Musk decides to switch it off. I can't comment whether he would be willing to do it or not. There are alternatives, though, and it's just going to take a while to implement it. And I do want to emphasize again, just to understand how military competition works, it's a constant adaptation battle, right? One side is doing something, you have an action, it triggers a reaction, right? That reaction triggers another action by the other side, and back and forth, right? It's an internal dialectic, right? So you never quite know what sort of capability will be on the battlefield for how long. You constantly need to rethink, innovate, adapt, and so forth, right? So that's why I'm very careful about individual platforms being really crucial or so important, because there's a constant shift on the battlefield, and that's why I go back there quite often, because every couple of months, every couple of weeks, the dynamics on the battlefield are somewhat changing. So that's why it's really important to be there. And the last question, I think I forgot. Did I cover everything? There was one more, I think, about.
Who to negotiate with? But
yes, the negotiation. Yes, I think, as I said, I think there is a danger. Even I don't really see large incentives now by the Russians to negotiate, And I also don't see a willingness by the Ukrainians to negotiate. There's a fundamental lack of trust. Even if both sides agree to enter negotiations, it can take many years. Let me warn you before you will have any result, right? I mean, one of the two sides will ultimately have to make a decision, or both sides hopefully have to make a decision that this war is no longer worth fighting for. It can still go on for many, many years, right? Just think of the Korean War, where people essentially knew by 1950 that it was not worth fighting for, and it took them 3 years. The Soviets in Afghanistan, they already made a decision a year after entering Afghanistan that it was a big mistake, and it took them another half a decade essentially to pull out, right? These types of settlements take time, and they take time because there's a fundamental lack of trust, and there's a particular lack of trust between Russia and Ukraine, because I do think there's a colonial aspect involved in all of this. For some in Ukraine, it's an existential war, obviously, right? And also for on the Russian side, there's obviously a lack of trust when they think the Ukrainians are just puppets of the West and so forth. So I do think this trust building is really important. And the last point that goes back again to what I said earlier about the more systemic changes that are happening. One benefit of having a hegemon like the United States, for example, or hegemonic power, or maybe two hegemonic powers in place, is that usually hegemonic powers are quite good, if they want to, at preventing so-called follow-on wars, right? Follow-on wars. So you have the Arab-Israeli wars, for example, right? There were a bunch of them. You had the 1948 war, then you had the 1967 war, the 1973 war, and so forth. If you think about it, the superpowers always intervened during these wars, right? And sort of tried to negotiate. Henry Kissinger's famous shuttle diplomacy in the 90s, in the Yom Kippur War in 1973 and so forth. And this was already very difficult, right? These, stopping additional wars from happening, right? It took a lot of effort. But if you don't have a hegemon, if, for example, there's an administration in the United States in place that isn't really interested in really properly getting involved in the Ukraine problem, you have an issue in terms of trust again, right? If Russia and Ukraine don't trust, you usually can refer to a hegemon, like, for example, in the 1990s, the Balkans, the Dayton Accords. Nobody trusted anyone, but it was the United States who ultimately guaranteed the peace. The same with the war in Korea, right? Where the United States essentially moved in and said, okay, I'm going to guarantee the peace. And if you don't have a hegemon who's willing to be the guarantor, you won't be able to bridge that initial lack of trust. And I think that's a big issue with the war in Ukraine also, because even if we have a ceasefire next month, we have peace negotiations, maybe even the signing of a peace agreement in like 2 years or so, if we don't have a guarantor or anyone who actually is ready to step in, there could be a potential follow-on war. And I just don't see any political will for anyone to do that.
Thank you so much. We already overstepped time a little bit. Thank you so much. It was very interesting. Unfortunately, not too positive, but I think we were not expecting this to happen. It's a very, very long way still to go. I do think, though, Mariana, there would be some steps actually also to get the Global South a little bit more on board. And it is essentially also what you have been saying, following international norms, but that means also being humble, doing it without hypocrisy. And that would be some way, and then maybe also, offer them something. Let's discuss the reform of the Security Council, for example. Why is India not there, but Great Britain is there? I mean, I think there would be a couple of things we could actually do there, but obviously I don't see a will there for now. But nevertheless, thank you so much. It was very interesting. I learned a lot. I hope you too. Thank you for coming. Maybe you're still going to be around a little bit. Let's open the windows, get some fresh air, and yeah. Okay.